Welcome everyone from Happy Break. So we have as our next speaker, Felipe Romero from the University of Vrije. He is now an assistant professor of philosophy there, and previously he was a postdoctoral researcher in Vrije Universiteit. Felipe works on philosophy of science and social epistemology, and often on topics that are at their intersection, so social epistemology of science. And he authored several papers actually on the replication crisis. He is one of the few people who introduced the topic to a philosophical audience, as far as I've observed. He wrote on scientific self-correction and the reward system of science, among many other topics. And today he will talk us about metascience as an emerging discipline. So the word metascience goes back and it had origins in as a science of science in other studies which were not united in a scientific discipline. So we're going to be hearing from him about the conceptual origins of this discipline. So, it is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for having me here. It's great for me to talk to interdisciplinary audiences about these topics. I'm going to be sharing some ideas, some thoughts about the emergence of metascience, which is one of the most interesting developments, I think, during the past 10 years in psychology and other fields. So, if that, of course, if the
maybe it's to direct towards the
we can just use these. Let's see. Oh, that. Okay. So if you have been to talks about the replication crisis, maybe at the beginning you see a slide like this, a slide with very depressing statistics, telling you about all the things that have gone wrong, showing you how things started from a relatively narrow focus with social psychology, and then started expanding. And you see statistics now about failures to replicate in a variety of fields across the social, behavioral, biomedical sciences. We have been already going through a decade, right? So perhaps a little more than a decade now since people started worrying about replication failures and what to do about them, and how to change science, how to improve science, how to make things better. So there is this paper that I contributed to that came out this year that showed about half of the multi-site replications in psychology give positive results, right? So this is a rather unsettling statistic as well. Now, how is the scientific community reacting? So one of the reactions is the one that I'm going to be focusing on here, is that we have this optimistic wave of meta-scientists. They have taken the lead. They are turning their scientific eyes onto science to improve science. And they have worked on a variety of proposals and assessments of the crisis. For instance, they have identified questionable research practices, bad statistics as potential culprits. They have defended the statistical reforms, publication reforms as solutions. And they are designing a variety of tools, developing techniques relying on data science, machine learning, complexity science to support such reforms. Now, the term metascience is not new, right? So now, of course, the field is becoming more popular, and you perhaps are hearing this term more than ever before. But what is interesting now is that metascience is becoming institutionalized, and this is what I'm going to be talking about. Now, metascience has also taken a sort of authoritative position in understanding the causes and solutions to the replication crisis. So we're going to talk about that as well. And I think this deserves philosophical attention. Why? Well, because philosophers in general are interested in how scientific fields emerge, how they develop, how they evolve. And I think it's interesting at the right time to do that with respect to metascience as well. So this talk is going to explore the emergence of metascience. So I'm going to be addressing some of some questions related to this. Perhaps I have more questions than answers, but I hope to convince you that these questions are interesting to think about. So how did metascience emerge? Where does the novelty of metascience lie? How does metascience relate to other fields that take science as their subject matter? And in order to shed light on these questions, I'm gonna discuss two models of discipline creation, right? So two ways of understanding how scientific disciplines arise and evolve. So here's the plan. So first, I'm gonna try to give a characterization of the field of metascience, showing you perhaps some attempts to define it. Of course, it's really hard. It's a very big umbrella that covers a lot of different kinds of projects, but we're gonna try to do that. Then I'm gonna talk about what we could call the spin-off model of discipline creation. So this idea that some scientific fields branch out from philosophy, and we're gonna see whether we can say that metascience is one of those fields. And then I'm going to talk about an entirely different view, which is that perhaps the advent of metascience can be seen more as a fashion, and that's perhaps one reason to worry about the development and the future of the field. Okay, so what is metascience? So here's my very short, irresponsible history of metascience. So even the term is perhaps used more since the 20th century. What we can take to be a metascientific spirit can be traced back to the 19th century. So in the work of Comte, for instance, you can see already a statement of the idea that science should be reflexive, right? This meaning that science should be the sort of activity that examines itself, right? So science is not this enterprise that is external to the world and explores the world and doesn't require foundation. The foundation for science should come from science itself, right? So the practices of science as Comte should be subject to empirical scrutiny as well. Now, this idea of science as reflexive was perhaps not really expressed in the 19th century, right? There was a lot of work, I think, on developing methods and so on, but perhaps this reflexive ideal was more clearly expressed in the 20th century. And perhaps you have heard, or maybe some of you work on these fields actually, scientometrics, bibliometrics, journalology, right? So all of these are labels that are used for the quantitative study of the publication landscape. And this is the sort of work that started in the 20th century and that perhaps we can identify explicitly as the first metascientific work. Now, what has happened in the 21st century? As I was mentioning at the beginning, so metascience is emerging as an institution. So what does this mean? Well, there are like several markers, I think, that suggest that this is the case. There's an increasing number of metascientific publications. There's an increasing number of centers and societies that promote metascience. So metrics, for instance, the Centers for Urban Science, Center for Scientific Integrity, the Meta Research Center at Tilburg, the Meta Research Group at Melbourne, right? So all of these places are attracting scientists to do metascience, right? So in many cases, maybe this is one way you can see the history of the field. You have scientists that were doing the first order work in their disciplines, psychology, biology, and so on, and they had like some metascientific concerns, and maybe they started identifying themselves more explicit than as metascientists. In some cases, they were leaving the first order work that they were doing to focus on metascientific projects, and in some cases, they are now associated with centers and societies that explicitly promote metascience. Now there are more dedicated conferences on the topic, and there's a growing community of practitioners. So many early career scholars are starting already their work by doing metascientific work. And there is a hope, right? So remember that all of this is happening in the context of the replication crisis. The hope is that metascience could rescue the replication crisis. Okay, so what is metascience? So how do we define metascience? So if you take the literal meaning of the word, you can say, well, metascience is the scientific study of science, but this is already problematic and naive, as Fiona Fiedler pointed out in a talk a couple of years ago. First, what is science is really hard already to tell what science is, to give a clear definition of the scientific enterprise. Second, what is a scientific study, right? So there isn't that univocal meaning of that term either. It's not that we can say, look, this is the scientific method and it's going to be applied to this subject matter. So it's really hard to say something substantive beyond just by working with those words. To make matters worse, so multiple fields already study science, right? So you have the history and philosophy of science, you have sociology of science, you have science and technology studies, right? So these are fields that use a variety of tools, in some cases empirical tools as well, to shed light on science from an external or sort of external perspective. Now, some of the things that I'm going to be saying here concern mostly history and philosophy of science, which is my home discipline, but I think similar things perhaps can be said about the sociology of science and technology studies. Now, these fields address similar issues, and I think there is an overlap, and it's not a trivial overlap, right? It's not that we have these fields that are studying science from a different perspective, and there is division of labor, right? So it's not that we say, okay, you historians and philosophers of science, you're working on these aspects, and then sociologists on this, and then metascientists on this, and everything is kind of progressing independently. Why? Well, metascientists ask questions that I think have been primarily in the domain of philosophy of science. Questions about the nature of scientific error, the nature of scientific progress, the nature of change. So these are questions that have already been in the domain of philosophers of science for several decades. Now, having said that, though, it is worth acknowledging that philosophy, I think, takes some time to focus on some issues that are present in the sciences at any given time, right? So we have been talking about replication crisis for already a decade. It took philosophers, I would say, about 5 years to start getting interested in the topic and start to see the topic not only as a problem of practice, right? Because that perhaps was a reaction that people had at the beginning. Like, look, this is a problem of pragmatics, right? Something that is happening because science is not going in the way that it's supposed to go. I think that has changed, and now you can find a lot of philosophical work that is engaging directly with aspects about replication, open science practices, publication practices, and so now this makes that this overlap is less trivial. Right? You have these several fields that are working on the same matters. Okay, so one question that you might ask in reaction to what I just said is the following: does it make sense to demarcate metascience, to say, okay, look, this is where the metascientific enterprise begins, and outside of that you have all these other activities? And this is an analog of the first order question, right? The demarcation of science, right? That's a question that was perhaps famously raised by Karl Popper. He was interested in seeing how science was different from other enterprises that were supposedly giving you knowledge, and what was valuable about science, what was the epistemic, especially epistemic science, epistemic study that science has with respect to other fields. And you may say, well, maybe it's worth asking this question about metascience as well. Why? Well, because maybe metascience does have an epistemically privileged position with respect to these other fields. Maybe it's epistemically privileged with respect to philosophy of science, sociology of science, and so on. And maybe you can say, well, maybe not really. Maybe this is not a really epistemically fruitful way of proceeding. Why? In the same way with the first order question, you can say that demarcating science and saying what science and is not, what is not science is not epistemically productive, because they are constraining people, they're constraining the freedom that the people would have, that scholars would have to explore different approaches and different matters, right? If you have a very clear answer and you say, look, this is not science, then you are already ruling out certain possibilities. And maybe that's something that we shouldn't do with respect to metascience, right? So maybe we just want to have 1,000 flowers bloom and let everyone explore the field in the way that they want. Along these lines, some people have also suggested that perhaps we should define metascience not so much as a field defined by a method, right? So that's the first, I think, intuition that people could have, is to say, look, there's something about the method, the methods that metascientists are using that make the field special. But you might think, well, maybe what metascience and these different scholars that work in this field have in common is that they share a purpose, right? They share the purpose of making science better, and everyone that subscribes, that accepts that purpose is part of that epistemic community, and maybe that's all there is to metascience. Now, one worry that I have with that way of defining the field is that if there is a community, I don't think it's cohesive at all. Maybe this is mostly anecdotal, and maybe this meeting is a counterexample to that, but I think there seems to be a little bit of an adversarial attitude between the different fields that take an external perspective about science. There is certain resistance to interdisciplinary discussions. For instance, if you have organized events on the matter, so we will see, maybe this is one of those exceptions, but my experience organizing events on the matter is that it's great, you have a lot of people excited, but then you usually observe, for instance, like 2 events happening at the same time. You have the metascientist event, you have the philosophers event, the historians event, and they are happening parallel in the same at the same time in the same rooms. There is also lack of citations. Maybe this is worth looking at more systematically. I haven't done that, but I think it's worth looking at that. But my sense is that there's a lack of citations from the philosophers to the scientists, and the scientists to the philosophers. Now, it could be that this is changing, right? So if you have some good news about that, I would love to hear them. Maybe things are progressing. Maybe, yeah, we have this meeting and we have a lot of people from different fields that are interested in the same matters, and maybe interdisciplinarity is really growing right now. But my sense is that in the development of science, we don't have really a cohesive community. Okay. Now, another way in which we could try to define metascience is by looking at exemplars of metascientific work. Rather than trying to give definitions, clear-cut definitions of what metascience is, we can look at the sort of things that metascientists do. And I'm going to give you here kind of a rough taxonomy that has 5 types of projects that metascientists engage in. So first is what we could call descriptive projects, projects like counting publications, citations, describing networks of influence, influence of models, right? So this is the work that started already in the 20th century with scientometrics, bibliometrics, and so on. Now, metascientists also engage in inferential projects, right? So these are projects that take a look at the first order work, and they try to say something substantive about the theories in that first order work, right? So you have evidence aggregation, meta-analysis, error detection, right? So these are projects that try to inform a scientist working on the first order issues. The third type is proofs of concept and tools development. Right? So the idea is that the scientists are also interested in developing the new tools, the new techniques that are going to make science better. So this is mostly theoretical work, right? So sometimes it comes, of course, with some empirical validation, but it's fundamentally theoretical work. In many cases, highly sophisticated work in terms of mathematical tools, computational tools, and so on. Okay. The fourth type is empirical studies on the scientific system itself. So you can say, as a proof of concept, maybe, for instance, adversarial collaboration is a good idea. So maybe, yes, having scholars who disagree, getting together and working on the same topics is something that would make science better. Well, you can test that empirically, right? And people have done that, right? So people are starting to test all these recommendations that you see better scientists give. They are looking at them from an empirical perspective to see if they're actually good. Same with replication. You can say, for instance, yes, replication is necessary for scientific self-correction, right? So that's something that you can think theoretically as possible. You can make some models to show that that's the case, but you can also address that empirically and see to what extent replication is actually making an improvement on scientists' capacity to self-correct. The use of badges, right? So you can say, yes, maybe this is a good incentive. You can measure that, and people are doing that as well. Now, this last type, the fifth type, is what I take to be more important. I'm going to go back to this later, which is the development of normative recommendations, right? In some fields, there is like this clear separation between what's descriptive and what is normative. Metascience is not one of those fields. So the boundaries between what descriptive and normative in metascience are completely blurred. And a lot of the work that metascientists do in the other 4 types is actually intended or used as the input to develop normative recommendations, to say, look, this is what scientists should do. This is what we should start doing from now on. And this transcends what you can write on a paper. This involves open science activism, actually going there and telling people how they can do their things in a better way, trying to train the new generations and so on. Okay. So I gave you like a broad idea of what I take metascience to be, different approaches, and I have suggested that maybe we should look at different products of metascientific work to have a better idea of what the field is. Now, how did this field emerge? Can we make sense of the emergence of metascience as a new scientific field? So here first I'm gonna discuss what we can call the spin-off model. And here's the motivating questions. Is the novelty of metascience primarily due to its empirical component? So that's something you could think. You could say, look, what's novel here that we are doing science, hard science over science. Now, the spin-off model gives us a relatively plausible story along these lines. So what is the spin-off model? So it's this idea that scientific disciplines have branched out from philosophy. Of course, I'm a philosopher. This is a little bit of a self-serving, story that I'm telling you here. It's one that philosophers, I think, like quite a bit when we talk about the emergence of modern science. We say, look, you had, for instance, in the case of physics, people from Aristotle until Newton were doing natural philosophy, right? And then at that point, something happened, which was that there was a certain conceptual clarity that allowed scholars to take for granted certain assumptions and then start diving in empirically on certain matters. And then that allowed the field of physics to emerge independently from philosophy, right? So there was a lot of conceptual work that enabled further empirical developments. And you can tell similar stories about psychology, for instance, maybe biology. In the same way, you can say, well, maybe metascience could be seen as the successor of philosophy of science. And some authors have said something along these lines. Some reasons in favor of this story. Metascience engages primarily with philosophical questions about science, but it uses empirical methods and puts the use of empirical methods at the forefront. Now, so metascience explicitly conceive their activity in this way. They say, look, we are actually doing this philosophy of science, but we are doing it with empirical methods. And they also view their work as kind of superseding or at least being fundamentally different from whatever came before, right? And here I go back to what I describe as a sort of resistance to engage with non-empirical fields that study science. Okay. Now, what are some problems with this way of understanding the emergence of metascience? I think that descriptively there is something like a spin-off going on, right? And I think it's fair to say that there are definitely questions that are better addressed with empirical methods that from the armchair, for instance, right? And there are some insights that you can gain doing empirical work about how science has progressed that go beyond what philosophers have said on the matter. Now we can ask, is this how we would like metascience to proceed? And I think there is one worry that I think whenever you work on these fields, you can perhaps see, which is that empirical work can't fix the lack of conceptual clarity. And some concepts about science are highly contested concepts. Just take the notion of replication, right? So I know some of you here have contributed to these large-scale replication projects, for instance. And something that happens in these cases is that one of the first problems that you face is to define replication. And then you say, okay, what's replication? And maybe you say, okay, this is a really hard question. Maybe let's just rely on some definition given in 2009 or something like that, and then let's not discuss that. Or then you get into a discussion, and then you settle for the less committal position, less controversial position that you could have. Or the alternative, you start doing the conceptual work, right? You start doing the philosophical work of trying to define what a replication is, right? And then the paper becomes something else, that becomes a very different sort of project. The same happens with related concepts, evidence, scientific progress, right? Like we are discussing here, scientific self-correction. So these are very highly contested concepts, and this conceptual work is primarily not empirical. So empirical matters can help, but this is fundamentally conceptual work. Now, something you could say in response to this is that metascience can also do conceptual work, and I think this has been the case. And at the beginning, something that I was kind of observing at the beginning of the replication crisis is that what I took to be the most interesting philosophy of science was actually not being done by philosophers of science, right? It was being done by people who saw the need of addressing certain conceptual issues, mainly people in psychology and related fields that they became metascientists, that they were trying to do this conceptual work. Now, what's the worry about this? That there is a risk of reinventing the wheel, right? Because there's a lot of work that perhaps came before that could be helpful, right? That you are not fully aware of, that has perhaps a struggle. Maybe that hasn't solved the problems, but has already struggled, has already faced limitations, has already hit the wall, so to speak, about what doesn't work when you engage in this conceptual work. So yes, many scientists in their own disciplines engage in highly sophisticated conceptual work, but there is a risk of reinventing the wheel and repeating mistakes if you ignore what has come before or what is happening in parallel in other disciplines. Now, there's a practical limitation, and we have to acknowledge that too. The work of philosophers is vast. Sometimes it's difficult to understand. There's a lot of jargon, so we are guilty of that. And metascientists often can't engage easily with it, right? And if you want, for instance, a clear-cut answer to the question of what a replication is, and you go and look at the philosopher, you're going to find a mess, right? And it's not going to be helpful, and you need a working definition to do your empirical investigation. So maybe that's not the place to look at. So yes, there is some truth to this problem. And this is perhaps something general that happens with philosophy of science, that you have philosophical work that sometimes is intended to inform the sciences, but is not really accessible by science. And in philosophy, we face this problem, the problem of thinking about our audience, right? So the field is so broad and it tries to speak to so many people that sometimes we're not speaking to nobody really. And or you end up doing what some people do, which is, well, they have some idea that could be fruitful, then you write the paper for the philosophers, you write the paper for the scientists, you write the paper for the public. But you know, that means 3 times the amount of work. So so this is a really serious practical difficulty. Now, in response, I would say that there are some scholars that work across disciplines, so some of you here, of course, that try to engage with the philosophical literature coming from the sciences, or that from philosophy trying to engage more with the scientific literature, and that's the place to look at, right? So that's perhaps the way in which we can address these difficulties in communication. Now, in short, I think it's epistemically costly to view metascience as a field that supersedes others. So it could be that at some point that will happen. You know, we would have to wait for that, and we will have to see if this would be only accessible retrospectively. And it could be that maybe metascience is going to supersede some portions of philosophy of science. But as it happens now, I think we first have to know what those other fields have to offer, in order to say to what extent they are limited and to what extent what metascientists do is different or not. Okay, so that is the spin-off model. Now let's move to the fashion model. Now I've been talking so far, assuming or making working with the assumption that there's something new about metascience that has to do with the empirical component of the field, right? So the fact that we're using these sophisticated empirical tools to make progress about science. You can perhaps disagree with that. You can say, well, yeah, maybe there isn't, maybe the novelty of that shouldn't be overstated. Why? Well, because we did have, as I said before, scientometrics, biometrics, and so on going on already in the 20th century. So what explains, well, how can we explain the current appeal of metascience? And here's one idea. Maybe the emergence of metascience does not obey merely epistemic needs, right? So it's not primarily that we are developing this new field in response to an epistemic problem. Maybe that's part of it, but some aspects of it could also be due to simply a scientific fashion. Now, some researchers in the social sciences have done some work studying fashion in science. This work is not very systematic, I have to say that. But I think it offers some interesting ideas to think about how fashion works and how fashion relates to science, and how and maybe how some of these phenomena can be seen in the emergence of metascience. Okay, so first you can ask, what does fashion have to do with science, right? So fashion is trivial, fashion is unimportant, right? So the average person accepts fashion without exerting the judgment, right? And here I'm saying that maybe we're doing that in science, right? So of course, that's something that we don't want to hear. So one of the scholars that has written on this says, for instance, scholars who examine social scientific paths or fashion risk the ire of their colleagues, right? And here I am telling a group of people interested in metascience that maybe this is something that is happening, right? So I'm going to try to do this in a friendly, constructive way, hopefully not risking the ire of my colleagues. But here's the idea. So what are some characteristics of fashion and what similarities does it have with metascience? So first, elites said fashions. And we can ask the question, are metascientists an elite? And I think it depends on who you ask. I think there are different narratives that you can identify these days. So one is the narrative of the scholars who are feeling attacked, right? And they say, look, you have like these self-appointed sheriffs and this, the methodological police, right? And they are telling everyone else what to do. And that's not good, right? So this is oppressive and so on. So another narrative is the narrative of people who are doing metascience, right? That perhaps sometimes perceive themselves as a minority in a group that has to fight against the mainstream. They have to fight against these traditional institutions. They have to change things, and they are working towards that, right? So in that sense, it's unclear whether metascience is an elite. There is one sense in which I do think that you can think of metascience as an elite, which is an epistemic sense, which is the sense that well, the metasciences are actually making normative proposals about what should be done, and to the extent and when they succeed, they become an elite. Why? Well, because if they succeed, for instance, convincing the traditional system that certain publication practices are preferable, that they convince their colleagues that they should adopt certain open science practices, for instance, then you have, I think, an epistemic elite that is telling the others what to do, and that is setting the fashion, so to speak. With fashion, there's also a phenomenon of conformity, right? So scholars adopt certain practices because they become standard. And sometimes the conformity is because you fully endorse it. You can say, look, I think this is great. I think this new scientific trend is the way to go. But if it becomes a standard, sometimes you can also say, well, I think I just have to follow this because people are telling me that this is what I have to do. So I'm just gonna follow the standard and that's it. That's a phenomenon of conformity. Now there is a kind of a simple process that you can identify with fashion that these authors have identified also in Fashions in Science, which is a process that involves first a sudden spurt of interest followed by an equally rapid decline. Right, so there's a lot of excitement first. This drives the popularity of scientific theories and methods. People think, look, this is really interesting, this is great. And then they're disappointed, right? So if these new theories, methods fail to provide what they promise, then people are going to rapidly lose interest and move on to the next faddish excitement. An example of this is the case of race at the beginning of the 20th century, right? A lot of scientists were interested in that, seemed very promising at the time. There was an explosion of research very quickly after after the project proved to not be fruitful. Scientists lost interest and moved on to the next thing. Now, some perhaps clarifications. It is not necessary to postulate deviant motives, and I want to emphasize this, on the side of the scientists when interpreting fashion in science, right? So it's not that you have this idea of, oh, I want to set a trend, I want to set the new fad, and I'm just gonna make plots and plans to create this situation in science. So that's not necessary for fashion in science to emerge. Another distinction that is worth making is, and this is a stipulation, but I think the distinction is meaningful between something that we could call fashion and something that is fashionable. So what is an example of something that is or what is a case of something that is not fashion but could be fashionable, right? When you have excitement about a new project and new approach, but it has a strong theoretical scientific support. So take the case of molecular genetics. After Watson and Crick's DNA model, so many biologists said, look, this is really exciting, really interesting, and they moved from the working in other fields of biology to work on molecular genetics, and that was actually good, right? So it was actually great that people started doing that because the DNA model proved to be epistemically fruitful for the progress of biology. Now, so what we would like, perhaps, and again, maybe we will see this retrospectively, is that the interest that we have in metascience is actually the case of a similar case to that of molecular genetics. Now, one problem that I think, okay, so let me continue with this idea. So let's talk about whether metascience has a strong theoretical scientific support. So some options in the context of open science practices. I'm going to focus on open science because, as I was saying before, there are a lot of different projects that fall under the realm of metascience. So let's focus on open science practices. You can say, well, maybe not. Maybe this is just people wanting you to do managerial work and making science boring and so on. So someone might think that. So people might say yes, and the community actually perceives the value of this work. And so people can say, well, yes, but perhaps most of the community does not perceive the value of this work, and they are adopting certain practices, as I was saying before, as a result of trying to conform to a new norm. So what does this mean in terms of the fashion process? So this possibility is that maybe there isn't a strong theoretical support, or that people are not perceiving it. This is the one that I find worrisome, that people are not perceiving the theoretical support and the need for certain practices. Well, then maybe some scientists might be adopting metascientific recommendations as mere fashion, and the prediction is that there will be disappointment, right? Well, because if you are not really taking seriously the practice is not going to deliver the goods that it promises, and then it's going to fail, and then it's going to be clear that it has failed in those cases, and then people will be disappointed and perhaps move to the next thing. There is also what I think we can identify as an element of performativeness that is related to what I think the adoption of certain open science practices is becoming, which is the following. So in general, you have performativeness in science when you have scientists pursuing a theory, model, method, or practice to elicit the approval from other members of the scientific community. Right? So this creates the false appearance of effective research. So here's one example of what I think could be seen as performative open science. So open science practices often conflict with the interests of publishers, journals, editors, but there's a lot of pressure to adopt them. Right? So people are kind of worried, maybe many early career scholars are worried, maybe we should engage in these practices. So what I think has been the solution from the traditional structures in science is, in particular the publication system, is to try to incorporate some of these practices, but constraining them in a way that they fit within the traditional structure. We can see an example of this with the case of pre-registration, right? So pre-registration is a practice that I think many people agree on theoretical grounds is a good practice, right? To make this clear distinction between exploratory and confirmatory research for particular kinds of projects. And you can say, yes, maybe we should do that. What happens in practice is that pre-registration is implemented in an opt-in way. So you can say, yes, conception is necessary, but as a matter of practice, you can decide or not whether to do it, even if it applies to the specific context that you are working in. And I think this comes from the fact that this is the way in which it best fits within the traditional publication system. Then as a result of that, maybe this is not a fully causal relation, but I think this work is consistent with what I'm telling. Pre-registered research sometimes exhibits unjustified deviations from plans, right? So this is just the scholars that have looked into this show that people deviate from their pre-registered plans without making acknowledgements of those deviations and without clear justification. But what I think the signals is that people are doing the practice perhaps in a performative way. They're saying, look, I'm just gonna fill the form because that's gonna make things perhaps easier for me to when I try to go through the publication pipeline, but maybe they are not really embracing the spirit of the practice. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here. So where is the revolution? So I think some meta-scientists would like to view the emergence of meta-science as a revolution, and you can discuss about how literal we want to be about that. Maybe some of these statements don't intend to be like deeply philosophical statements, or maybe intend to mean it in a deeply philosophical sense. You might say, well, maybe there's a Kuhnian revolution happening now in science as a result of the replication crisis, but I think this is at best not clear. I think meta-science shouldn't be understood as a spin-off from philosophy of science. Why? Because some understood, I think, it can degenerate into methodological fetishism without conceptual clarity. Now, this doesn't mean that we need division of labor, that we need philosophers, we need meta-scientists. As I said before, a lot of interesting conceptual work is being done within meta-science itself, but we have to acknowledge that sort of work is part of what we need to do. Now, if meta-science is not a spin-off, then it shouldn't be seen as an authoritative field, understanding the replication crisis and finding its solutions. And all of this to say, yeah, that maybe meta-science should incorporate philosophy of science more explicitly, and perhaps we can tell similar stories about sociology of science, science and technology studies, and so on. Now, meta-science risks a decline if it's merely seen and adopted as a fashion, right? So this is one I think, risk that we can see these days, right? And the prediction is that there could be this rapid decline in a few years if it becomes merely a fashionable topic. And I think novelty meta-science, more than in the empirical component, lies on the normative projects, right? And developing normative proposals and the subsequent activism that follows from that. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
So like we did last 5 minutes, start with clarification questions or small questions, and if there are any, and proceed with more discursive ones.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure it's a small question, but I'll give it a try anyway. Thank you for this really interesting presentation. I liked it a lot, but I'm not sure I completely agree. You gave an overview of meta-science and told us about the overlap it has with philosophy, history of science, science and technology studies, maybe a little bit of psychometrics, and that it might have overlapping interests. Now, my question is that I agree that metascience overlaps, but to me it's important that the core trait of metascience, which I would label more as research on research, that the core trait is that it focuses on providing an empirical base for things like open science, research integrity, responsible research, and maybe responsible research and innovation, but an empirical base for that, with a view to explain and also to maybe solve the replication crisis and a few more things. To me, it is that simple, and it would be acceptable when that would be a fashion. When the problem is solved, we can move on.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think there are a couple of different things that I can say in response. So maybe first about the fashion point. So I mean, you can say, again, I said when I make this distinction between fashion and fashionable, it was sort of a stipulation, but because maybe it could be very similar, but it could be, and maybe this would be a welcome development to say, well, maybe it's fashionable, right? Fashionable meaning, look, this is something we are doing that is attracting a lot of people, but that is actually making science better, right? So that would be, you know, the welcome development of the science, right? You say, yes, maybe it becomes fashionable and it delivers the goods, maybe solve the replication crisis, right? So I'm not sure. So I don't think we disagree about that, right? So that would. Now, what I perhaps would stress is that it's not clear how this is going to pan out, right? So that would be what I think is desirable for the field. Now, the first part of your comment, I think maybe I can interpret you as viewing metascience as a fundamentally empirical activity. And if that's the case, then maybe you know, I perhaps could ask you back. Okay, so then how should we view this also pressing conceptual work that needs to be done in the vicinity of fixing the replication crisis, right? So providing a good understanding of what scientific progress is, or what scientific self-correction is, or what replication is, right? So maybe we say, look, metascience is purely a pure empirical field. Then maybe we do need the philosophers of science doing that sort of work, and then there should be division of labor. Maybe that's another way of seeing how things should progress. So I don't know if that's something they would favor.
No, I'm a simple person in that sense. The idea is on the table that open science modalities might be helpful in solving the replication crisis.
Yeah.
And to me, metascience or research on research is an empirical way to study whether that's reasonable to expect and whether it happens when you try. So, but you're probably correct that when you say that there are some normative and theoretical notations to metascience as well. And that is more overlapping with stuff we had already before. I agree with that.
Yeah, I think I would like to emphasize that, right? I would like to emphasize that and maybe, yeah, to perhaps shift a little bit the focus from this idea of that we can solve, you know, the replication crisis only by doing empirical work, right? So that if you are a little bit on board with that idea, then
well, you need a few good ideas, of course, to start empirical works, but
yeah.
These ideas are on the table, I believe.
Okay. Yeah, well, then yeah, I mean that could be something to say in favor of kind of the spin-off model. You say, look, the conceptual work has already been. I think I disagree with that part, but maybe you could say the conceptual work is already laid down, and now you can proceed with the empirical component.
Maybe hand off to the chair again.
So just, you know, 3 short questions. You don't have to answer all of them. The first one is descriptive and is clarifying. I was just curious how you thought this metascience activity fits within the broader context of science of science or research on research, which is slightly more inclusive or whatever. And the reason I mention that is because those other things certainly make an effort to gain status by appealing to philosophy and sociology in terms of their ability to kind of like measure them in objective and replicable ways, right? So they actually reach back, you know, as a discursive strategy. I would say metascience is less likely to do that. The second question is like, I was like totally confused by your limits of performativity discussion, because while it's true that yes, publishers are kind of like trying to squeeze open science activities like, you know, open access publications into their formats, still like almost all scientific publications are now, with the exception of medical science, like online and freely available and updated. You know, it's like it's totally changed. Like, yes, this performativity, yes, they're not in the spirit of doing it, but they do it, you know, and it actually changes empirically the distribution of global attention to science. So I would say it's massively changed empirical distribution of science, regardless of the spirit. And the third is, I was missing. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can even, you know, talk, yeah, sure.
So I think maybe let me start with the second one. So I think this would depend on the specific practice that we're talking about. So I think, because I see your point, you say, well, when it comes to open access publications, then you already have all the archives and so on, like.
And this changed it. This discourse changed it.
This has changed very rapidly. And now you have the meta archive and so on. But I think it would depend on the specific practice, right? And the case that I was making here was specifically for the practice of pre-registration, right? That's one case in which I do think perhaps
I was missing even for that case. I mean, I know myself, I've been bullied into pre-registration, and it has changed my practices and changed empirically the papers that I didn't enter, you know, like willingly. I was, you know, a reviewer forced me into it, but it changed the paper anyway. So I think
but it changed. I mean, for good, right? So hopefully.
I don't know, but it definitely changed it. You know,
because the sort of change that.
I'm saying it didn't require my spiritual assent for it to change the activity and the consequence of my science.
Well, maybe the spiritual assent is too much to ask for, but
Exactly.
a change in a way that you view that your scientific practice is better. So that's what I think. You know, if you have that, then that's already winning, right? But the problem is, yeah, when you just fill the form and you say, look, I'm doing this because I'm bullied into doing that, but you see absolutely no value on doing it, right? And then you start doing it because it becomes part of the publication pipeline, and it becomes part of what your Congress wanted to do, and so on, right? So that's when it becomes kind of a performance.
No, right. But this is my last point and question. I'm just curious. I'm super quick about it. I mean, there are unintended consequences, obviously, on this focus on replication and replicability. For example, and I think this is the most nefarious one, a decrease in the variance of conceptual approaches to a particular experiment, which decreases the robustness of particular scientific claims as they leave, for the purpose of performative replicability. And I can show a number of empirical cases where this is precisely the case. So I think there are things where this performativity, which is to say valuing replication above other things, actually screws up a variety of other values for science, which I didn't see you mention. It seems consistent with the spirit of your discussion.
Yeah, I agree. I think I disagree with your assessment of what happens with replication research.
Oh, no, I can specify cases which we would not disagree. I assure you. I mean,
because so here's what I think. I think yes, you can
like
say, well, if you are focusing more on replication research, you are kind of hindering, you know, sort of creativity, you know, some more exploratory research. And I think, well,
that's not my claim. I'm talking about replicability. So if you narrow the scope of the research so that you can increase its replication, then that, for example, biological fact may be less likely to replicate in the clinic, which is to say outside the scope of the replicated context.
But then, okay, so it's kind of the question is about the trade-off between how direct you want your replication to be and how. Yeah, I mean, I think I would prefer to have more modest replicable claims than broader claims that we don't know whether to replicate or not.
I thought you would agree with my comment, and I see that you are on the metascience wagon. So I'm with you. I mean, I see you.
I mean, there's a trade-off, and of course, we have limited resources, and then you can have different values of what you think we should invest in. Yeah, at least I guess I put my cards on the table. Thank you.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes, maybe a little bit more for 4 questions now. So we'll try our best. Let's start with Daniel.
Hey, so thanks for the talk. I'm interested in what you mentioned about philosophy being incorporated and maybe science and technology studies as well. I'm not completely sure if the difference is the empirical part, actually, because I think it helps, but a lot of the stuff that has been done is actually just an analysis of how do we achieve aims we wanted to agree upon. Like if you want to have a reliable statistical inference, you shouldn't p-hack. We don't really need empirical data, right, to know that it's a problem if you p-hack, that you don't get reliable findings. You can simulate it or just logically deduce it, I would say. But there is stuff from philosophy that could be useful. Personally speaking, I kind of like work by Karl Popper, for example, and find it very useful in thinking about what I'm trying to do. But it seems in philosophy that is ridiculously out of fashion. If I say that I like Karl Popper, then maybe there are 3 people left in the world who think that that's good. But typically the answer is that we moved beyond this, which is true, but you move beyond things in directions that are not useful for me. So I would like to be maybe a bit more provocative and say that the difference is not the empirical content or not, but the fact that what metascience is doing is useful for scientists. In the sense that it helps them to do things that they want to do. For example, if you do your PhD and things just don't replicate, you build on the literature, and you just don't manage to replicate stuff you want to build on, all of a sudden, you can replicate on things that you want to build, which is what they want to do. It's a bit more provocative, but I think that is really, in my experience, especially the science and technology studies, which I will not talk about because then I will get upset. The mangle of practice. But I also ask people, like, does it help? Like, in what way does this help? And then people in science and technology studies actually often say, no, our work is not supposed to help. We ask critical questions. But what I want to do is just do a better job when I do my next study next week in the lab. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. So I think it depends on the sort of particular work in philosophy of science that you're looking at. Some philosophers of science would say, yeah, philosophy of science, kind of like primatology, it doesn't need to be useful to primates, right? Now, I don't think
that's true. Right. That's true.
So I don't think.
But then I wouldn't use it, of course.
As
a primate.
I don't think there's space. I think there's some space for primatology, but I do think that some of the work that philosophers do has an intent of making science better, right? And then the problem is, well, maybe scientists are not reading this work. Right, so that's where I see the problem. So maybe you can see that more within philosophy of science than in relation to science and technology studies, for instance. But at least within philosophy of science, I think it is work that has that clear intent. Now there is a further question: does this work help me or not? And I think in many cases there are like these barriers of access that I was mentioning. That I think is rather unfortunate, but it does happen that you have work that is philosophical and it tends to help scientists, but then you read it and then you have to read the whole history of philosophy to be able to parse the first 2 sentences, right? So then that's not going to help you.
But also because I read a lot of philosophy, so that's not the problem, and I studied it. So
so you were reading Mayo, I think.
Yeah, but from the other side, it's also true. It's not that I need to read the history of philosophy, but as a philosopher, you might need to do 4 years of empirical research to understand what the practical problems is that I need solutions for. And that part is also missing. I agree, the other part is also missing. So they should read more philosophy.
Yeah, no, so it goes both ways, right?
I think this is a perfect question for the plenary. Because I also have a few questions quite similar to this, and we should definitely discuss this more and not squeeze into these a few seconds. Shall we do that?
Yeah.
Because we have like plenty of opportunity to discuss this later. We can have maybe one, or if it's short, two more questions. John. So you change your mind, then yeah.
Try to be very quick. By coincidence, I've had a bit to do with some scholars of fashion studies recently, and I reckon they'd object to some of your characterizations of fashion as a metaphor, but perhaps not the idea that fashion is widely perceived as trivial. But that's a one-by. I've got one comment and one question. The comment is maybe it's just where I come from as someone in a meta research centre that's based in an HPS department. But I do see good news. Just last year, the Open Science Centre organised a symposium on criticisms of meta-science. I organised with David Peterson a session at the 4S STS conference, and the AMOS conference had a discussion on this. So I certainly see a lot of goodwill, if not yet the capacity for reasons that you mentioned, and that Daniel's alluded to for this kind of engagement. My question is, I was interested in your description of the spin-off model as spin-off from philosophy, when I think most people would think of it as meta-science as a spin-off from disciplines. And I'm thinking about Nicole Nelson's work on the methodologist as a category of actor. And so, that's my question is to you. Why would you characterize it as a spin-off from philosophy rather than what most people's experience would be as a spin-off from existing scientific disciplines?
Great, that's good. So I think what I was offering was perhaps what philosophy people can call like a rational reconstruction, right? It's not that people are thinking explicitly, look, this is what we are doing. We're now taking these philosophical questions, now approaching them with these methods, right? So having that in mind, I think it's possible to think that what I'm saying is the case, even if it doesn't happen literally in the way that I'm saying. Now, I do have to think about this I guess descriptive story more. But I guess the reason that I can give for why I took this approach is mostly because that's the way in which, in philosophy, the emergence of new disciplines is kind of seen, right? So there is this model that as you know, it has been told about like physics and psychology and so on. So that's what I took this route. But yeah, it might be worth thinking. I will take a look into that to see to what extent we can see that as a spin-off from other disciplines.
So yeah, we had one more question there. Hey.
I'm Taim. I'm a fresh PhD student, and since Anna explicitly solicited stupid questions, I hope to be the main supplier in the next few days. So thinking about or accepting that meta-science, the advent of meta-science as we see it now, is accepting that it is not really new, neither in its method nor in its philosophy or aims or conceptualization. To what extent do you think the current popularity or its advent is contributable to merely practical reasons, like the internet and the feasibility of meta-scientific methods and the accessibility of it? Up until just a few years, it wasn't that institutionalized, and most scientists were doing meta-science as a side hustle, right? Because it can be done now with the internet much more easily, I think, than earlier on at the time of Neil or Cohen, or whose work you can see as meta-science, but I think it was more difficult than to access a lot of papers and look at them and so on.
Great. I kind of like this sort of kind of deflationary story that you are telling, right? So, well, there are a lot of practical developments that have enabled the development of the field. It would be interesting to perhaps see, I don't have a sense of that, I'm just thinking out loud, but to compare how that has affected science in general, to see whether there's something different happening with meta-science. But yeah, but as a matter of fact, I think right that a lot of this work relies and is made feasible and easier now because of technology. So and I kind of, yeah, I think I like the sort of deflationary story that maybe something really practical that just enabled the field to emerge and to develop.
Thank you very much. I suggest that we take just 2 minutes to shake off and like meet here with, this is not a coffee break, just 2 minutes before the next one.